while we defend our lives against the destroyer that would devour us all. For I do not love the bright sword for its sharpness, nor the arrow for its swiftness, nor the warrior for his glory. I only love that which they defend. J.R.R. Tolkien was right in saying this. As horrible as war is, it must be. But at what point is it right to go to war? Look at the Civil War. Americans fought against one another in one of the bloodiest battles in history. Result, the South was right to fight the Civil War. Scientists tend to show that not only did they fight to protect what they believed in, but they fought to protect the fundamental values America was founded upon. Contention 1. The South had reason to secede. Many people will jump immediately to the conclusion that the war was fought because the Union wanted to free the slaves and the South wanted to keep them. But there were several contributing factors to the South's secession, with slavery being only one issue in a pool of controversy. The largest issue was states' rights. The federal government was seeking to override the states' decisions for issues like slavery and secession, meaning that instead of winning them over by reasoning, they sought to change their laws by force. However, Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, shows how just one piece of literature can change the attitude of a nation towards an issue. Instead of using methods like this, the government began to take away that which many of these states had just fought so hard to gain, which led to their desire to secede. Contention 2, the South had reason to go to war. The South fought because their rights were being threatened. They knew that if they caved on this issue and allowed the federal government to override their decisions on it, that they could continue to do so in the future with other issues. As James Madison said, the very definition of tyranny is when all powers are gathered under one place. Because of this, many of the amendments made to the Constitution were made in order to limit the federal government's power, specifically the 10th Amendment. As Patrick Henry said, the Constitution is not an instrument for the government to restrain the people, it is an instrument for the people to restrain the government. The South's motives and choices were based upon protecting the values this country was built upon. When the South lost the war, they lost the fight for states' rights. Contention 3, the South was justified in fighting for their rights. The South would never have fought so hard if it was merely to keep property for monetary gain. They were fighting for something they held so dear, they would sacrifice hundreds of thousands of their own lives to protect it. The Union fought for the government, but the South fought for America. The South was right to fight the Civil War. It's not about the war itself, it's about why they fought it. Why they banded together and fought with everything they had to keep something precious. Freedom. I have shown that the South fought the war not out of selfishness, not out of monetary or economic desire, but out of a desire to protect the rights of themselves and those to follow after them. In addition to this, I have shown that when the South lost, the states lost much of the power they were entitled to by the Constitution. The South honored the founders of the country they loved by dying for what they lived for. Time.
Okay. In your honest opinion, do you think the U.S. is what the U.S. is today would be a better place if the South had won the war?
Yes.
Okay. By saying that, do you realize that the possibility of slavery having gone well into the 1900s was undoubtable?
I think that slavery would still have ended. Like I said, Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, Uncle Tom's Cabin, shows how just one piece of literature can change the attitude of an entire nation towards an issue. And that even if the South had won, slavery would have ended out of a conviction, not out of force, ending much of the racism we see today and in the past leading up to this.
Okay, but there was a high chance of the slavery lasting a lot longer, as even Robert E. Lee had slaves, and giving them up would have cost them financially. Is that correct?
There's a possibility, yes.
All right, thank you. You say the South was fighting for its freedom, correct?
Yes.
Don't you think forcing their own citizens to fight and likely die is a violation of that same freedom?
The U.S. has drafted soldiers before against their will.
Thank you. The Founding Fathers instituted the federal government to unify the states. The South was fighting to rebel that rule. Is that correct?
No.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, close time.
1861, the South fired on Fort Sumter, starting the bloodiest 4 years in American history, the Civil War. Because of the undeniable facts, I negate the resolution that the South was right in fighting the Civil War. At the beginning, the Americans in what is now the United States were loyal citizens of England, with no desire to secede. They tried for decades and decades to gain representation, fair taxes, and not be forced to house British troops. Only until after England had become a complete tyrant did they even consider secession as a solution. And even then, they realized that it was an extremely serious action, only to be used as a last resort. When it was made clear that England had no respect for the rights, only then did the United States break off from England. Because secession was such a drastic action, in the Declaration of Independence, the Americans included an indictment of outrageous violations England had made against their freedom and rights. The significant difference between the Americans before the Revolutionary War and the South before the Civil War is that the South did not have sufficient reason to start the Civil War. Contention number one, the South's motives for fighting the Civil War were wrong. According to AmericanHistoryAbout.com, most of the reasons concerning why the South started the war root back to the South's desire to have the right to own slaves, which they thought was threatened when Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election of 1860. Because the South's main economy was based on agriculture, they needed a large workforce to fulfill the demand for their crops. However, the claim that they needed the slaves to prevent an economic crash is invalid, as nothing was to keep them from hiring paid freed slaves as a fair wage. Rather, it was more out of inhumane greed that they tried to keep their workers enslaved. Another reason for the South fighting the war was to give the states more power, which they thought the federal government was restricting, such as the right for a state to decide if it is to follow certain federal laws. Yet the so-called restrictions the federal government imposed on the states were not as restrictive as what the federal government imposes on states today, and yet most Americans have never considered such an extreme and damaging action as seceding from the U.S. again. Contention number two, the South was unconstitutional in seceding from the United States. Although the Constitution did not specifically mention whether or not the states had the right to secede, the entire purpose for the Constitution was to unite the states with the federal government. By breaking off from the Union, the South broke the very bonds that were created in both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution between we, the people. This defied the Founding Fathers' very purpose of creating a unified nation. In other words, if states were allowed at any time to secede from the Union, then the United States of America today would most likely be multiple struggling countries, showing the world that democracy is weak. Contention number three, the South had bad ethics in regard to the war. The Confederate States were the oppressors. Instead of being oppressed by the government as America was by England, they were oppressive to more than a quarter of their population, the slaves. According to the Virginian Encyclopedia, the South also attempted blackmail to the North in progressing a political decision by making it clear that if a Republican was elected, they would secede from the North, taking with them trade agreements and revenue that belonged to the United States as a whole. Also, the rights and freedom they were fighting for, they contradicted by forcing their own citizens in a draft to fight and likely die in this war. Compared to the abusive violation of the American rights by England, the issues the states had with each other and the government were considerably minor. The seceding states also did not make even near the effort to settle their differences peacefully with the North, as the Americans had tried with England. By starting the Civil War for the sake of monetary gain and political power, the South was writing a death sentence for hundreds of thousands of their own citizens. History shows that the South was wrong in fighting the Civil War. Therefore, it is impossible for the affirmative to carry the burden of proof.
Hold on just a second. Let's let John have it.
Okay. Do you believe the American Revolution was justified?
For who?
The Americans. Do you believe they were justified in fighting the Revolutionary War?
I believe that they...
Yes or no?
Well, I like to... Can I explain my answer?
Briefly.
Okay. I believe that they broke England's law by having a revolution, but it was crucial for their freedom, which they valued. In a way, yes.
Okay. So the American Revolution started due to what we call a tyrannical government imposing unfair laws on the unrepresented colonies, correct?
Over a lot of other things, yes. There was a huge list of indictments.
Do you agree with James Madison's definition of tyranny that says that it's when all powers are under one place?
I'm not familiar with that definition. Under one place, as in the government?
Or under one person, yes.
Yes.
So if tyranny is power being held all in one place, then the American Revolution sought to separate powers, correct?
Yes, they did not agree with England's violations of their freedom, so they separated, yes.
The Constitution limits the powers of the federal government, meaning that all powers not delegated to the federal government are reserved for the states. Isn't that true?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
The Constitution limits the powers of the federal government, meaning that all powers not delegated to the federal government are reserved for the states. Correct?
Correct.
The federal government did not have the powers delegated to it to deny the rights of states. Correct? To deny the rights of states. Was that something that was delegated to them?
Correct. They did not have that right.
That's exactly what they were doing by denying the Confederate States secession. It is the right of the states, according to the Declaration of Independence, to alter or abolish any form of government that is destructive of the ends for which it was established. America was established as a government of the people, by the people,
Time.
and for the people. The affirmative's argument clearly states that the South had reason for what they did. And in my cross-examination, I showed that it was not only a right of the states, but a duty given them by the Founding Fathers to alter or abolish any form of government that was becoming destructive of the purpose for which it was formed. If the United States was formed, as Abraham Lincoln said, as a country of the people, by the people, and for the people, then the government attempting to take away the rights of the states that were allowed for in the Constitution according to the 10th Amendment is becoming destructive of the purpose set out by the Founders. This must then mean that the South was right to fight the Civil War. They were not only provoked by the North, who threatened their rights, but they were given that duty by the Founders of this country. When the federal government began to use powers that weren't theirs to begin with, the South had reason to want to secede from the Union. Moreover, the federal government tried to make a constitutional amendment to deny the states the right of secession, which failed to pass, which means that up to that point, it had been a known right, and since it didn't pass, still was during the Civil War. The resolution states that the South was right to fight the Civil War, and they were. But more than that, the South attempted to leave the Union peacefully, which means that war wasn't the first thing on their mind. They valued both their freedom and the lives of their people, but they knew that when faced with the choice between those two, their people were willing to sacrifice their lives to guarantee their freedom. Because of this, and because of the other evidence I have shown, I ask that you side with the affirmative in believing that the South was right to fight the Civil War. Time.
The South did have reason to fight the Civil War, but their reasons did not justify fighting. Their reasons were wrong and cost 600,000 lives. The opposition said they tried to leave peacefully, but they were the ones that attacked a federally owned Fort Sumter, which started the war. That was a direct declaration of war by attacking a sovereign power. Despite the opposition's arguments, there is no way that the South can be right in starting and fighting a war that would cost the lives of over 600,000 people for the purpose of eliminating a few taxes and restrictions. The South said they were fighting for their rights and freedom, but at the same time they violated their own citizens' freedom by forcing them to fight in a war they would likely be killed in. The only outcomes of the war would be either the South losing, and then all the lives and destruction the war cost are for no cause, or the South winning, which would divide the nation with no obligation to keep other states from breaking off and for any reason they might choose, thus defying the whole purpose of the Constitution. By ratifying the Constitution and breaking the bonds made by their forefathers to keep the Union together, the South could be nothing but wrong. The South's reasons for starting the war, their disrespect for the Constitution, and their bad ethics during the war only go to prove just how impossible it is for the opposition to carry the burden of proof, which is why I negate the resolution that the South was right in fighting the war. Therefore, I ask that you would agree that the South was wrong in fighting the Civil War.
The direct attack on Fort Sumter was due to the Union denying the South secession. Secession was the reaction to the South not having the ability to keep the rights and laws given them in the Constitution. The Constitution directly allowed for slavery, which means that the federal government could not constitutionally take it away, because it is for the states to decide. I hold to, still, that the South was right to fight the Civil War, even if there was no other reason for them doing so than trying to limit the federal government's reach into the states' rights. But there were plenty of more reasons, as I have shown. I argue that I have carried this resolution and have shown evidence enough to support it. I have shown that the South had reason to secede, and because they couldn't secede, they had reason to go to war. And since they had reason to go to war, they were right to fight the Civil War. Each argument builds on the prior, proving the resolution in the end. Because of this, and the other arguments made, I ask that you side with the affirmative in this case. Thank you.
Thank you.